Don't waste any seeds on her, the Duke said. By summer her garden was the envy of everyone. Don't waste any seeds on her. She'll kill them within a week, same as everything else in that empty house. Margaret Ellery heard the words through the thin wall of the estate's toolshed, and she did not move. She stood with her hand still resting on a bag of unopened seed packets, listening to the voice of Duke Harrington Cole discuss her like she was a stray dog that had wandered onto his property. She was 62 years old. She had buried a husband, raised 2 children who rarely called anymore, and moved into the caretaker's cottage on the Cole estate 8 months ago because it was the only place she could afford after the bank took her house in Ohio. She was not going to cry over a man who didn't know her name well enough to bother learning it. But something in his voice, that flat, dismissive certainty, settled into her chest like a stone. She had asked 3 days earlier if she could plant something in the small forgotten plot behind the cottage. The old groundskeeper had told her it used to be a cutting garden decades ago, before the Duke's late wife passed and everyone stopped tending it. Margaret only wanted a few tomatoes. Maybe some zinnias if there was room. She hadn't expected the Duke himself to weigh in on it to his estate manager, in a conversation she was never meant to hear. She's got no experience, the Duke continued. I looked into it. Widow, moved up from some rental in Dayton. Doesn't know the first thing about soil out here. Give her seeds and she'll waste them, and then she'll come asking for more, and I'll have spent money on nothing. The estate manager, a younger man named Foster, said something too quiet for Margaret to catch. No, the Duke said. Let her have the dirt. Just don't waste any seeds on her. Margaret set the seed bag down on the shelf, gently, the way you set down something you don't want to break by accident. Then she walked back to the cottage, and she did not knock on the manor door to demand an apology, and she did not call her daughter to complain. She did something else entirely. She opened her late husband's old toolbox, the one she'd carried across 3 moves and never once used, and underneath the wrenches she'd never touched, she found the envelope. It had been sitting there for 4 years. Frank had left it for her before the cancer took him, a small collection of seed packets he'd saved from his own mother's garden in Kentucky, heirloom tomatoes, old-fashioned marigolds, a strain of morning glory that didn't exist in stores anymore. He'd told her once, half joking, that seeds like that were worth more than the house. She had never planted them. She hadn't had the heart or the yard, or maybe just the courage to try something and fail at it alone. She looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she went outside with a shovel that was too heavy for her hands and began turning the soil behind the cottage, 1 square foot at a time, before the sun was even fully up the next morning. For the first 2 weeks nobody noticed. The plot was hidden behind an old stone wall, out of view from the main house, and Margaret worked it in the early mornings before Foster came around to check the grounds. She used what she had. Frank's seeds, a bag of composted soil she bought with grocery money she didn't quite have to spare, and every piece of advice she remembered her own mother giving her 60 years earlier about a garden in a much smaller yard in a much poorer town. She talked to the plants. She knew it was foolish, and she did it anyway, because there was no one else in the cottage to talk to. By the 3rd week, the tomato seedlings had pushed through, small and green and stubborn. Foster found her there on a Tuesday morning, kneeling in the dirt with soil under her fingernails, and he stopped walking. He didn't say anything about the conversation she'd overheard. He had no way of knowing she'd heard it, but he looked at the rows she'd planted, the string she'd used to mark them straight, the careful spacing between each seedling, and something in his expression changed. You've done this before, he said. My whole life, Margaret answered, not looking up. Just not for a while. He didn't mention it to the Duke. Not yet. The first complication came in May, when a hard frost warning hit the region 2 days after Margaret had already set out her more delicate seedlings. She sat up until midnight covering each row with old bedsheets and buckets, anything she could find, working by flashlight in the cold. Her hands ached the next morning. Every plant survived. The second complication was harder to cover with a bedsheet. The Duke's grandson, a boy of 9 named Theodore, wandered onto the estate grounds while visiting for the summer and found Margaret's garden before anyone told him it existed. He trampled 2 rows of marigolds chasing a rabbit, not out of cruelty, just the carelessness of a child who didn't know the ground held anything worth protecting. Margaret found him standing over the damage, frozen, waiting to be yelled at. She didn't yell. She knelt down next to him and showed him how to press the soil back around the surviving roots, and she told him quietly that even a garden that gets hurt can usually recover, if somebody's patient enough to help it. Theodore came back the next day. And the day after that. By June he was asking her the names of things. It was Theodore, in the end, who told his grandfather about the garden. He did it innocently at the dinner table, describing the tomatoes that were almost as tall as him, and the flowers that smelled like Grandma's greenhouse used to. The Duke set down his fork. "Whose garden?" "Miss Margaret's. Behind the cottage." The Duke didn't say anything else that night. But the next morning, for the first time since Margaret had moved onto the estate, Duke Harrington Cole walked the long path behind the stone wall himself. What he found stopped him where he stood. The plot that had been abandoned dirt for over a decade was no longer dirt. Tomato vines climbed a homemade trellis of scavenged branches. Rows of zinnias and marigolds bordered the walkway in colors he hadn't seen on the property since his wife was alive. And in the far corner, morning glories had begun to climb the old stone wall itself, the same pale blue-purple color. He realized with a jolt he wasn't prepared for, as the ones his wife used to grow along that very wall 30 years earlier. He stood there long enough that Margaret noticed him from the cottage window and came outside, wiping her hands on her apron, unsure what to expect. "These flowers," the Duke said, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him. "The morning glories. Where did you get that variety?" "They were my husband's mother's," Margaret said carefully. "An old strain. You don't find it in stores. My wife grew the same ones. Right here. This exact wall." He looked at her and for the first time actually looked at her, not as a problem to be managed but as a person standing in front of him. "I told Foster not to waste seeds on you." Margaret held his gaze. "I heard you say it." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. The Duke looked down at the dirt, then back up at the flowers, then finally at her. "I was wrong," he said. It came out rough, like the words hadn't been used in a while. "I judged you before I knew a single thing about you. I assumed a woman my estate manager described as broke and unskilled would fail here. The same way I assumed a lot of things after my wife died and I stopped paying attention to anything that grew." He paused. "I'm sorry. That's not something I say often. I mean it now." Margaret didn't rush to forgive him. She'd earned the right not to. "Your grandson helped the last few weeks," she said instead. "He's got good hands for it." The Duke looked toward the house, where Theodore was watching from a window, and something in his face softened further. By midsummer, word of the garden had spread through the small town that bordered the estate. Neighbors who used to pass the Cole property without a glance started slowing their cars at the stone wall to see the color spilling over it. A local paper ran a small feature. The Duke, who had spent a decade letting that section of his land go to seed out of grief he never named out loud, found himself standing at the wall most evenings, watching Margaret work, sometimes talking, more often just present. He offered eventually to pay her, properly as a gardener on staff, not as a caretaker doing this on the side for nothing. Margaret considered it. Then she said something that surprised him. "I don't want your money for this part of it. This garden isn't for the estate. It's for me. But I'll take a job managing the rest of the grounds properly, if you're offering one." He offered one. She accepted. By the end of August, the plot behind the stone wall had become the single most photographed spot on the entire estate. Neighbors asked to walk through it. The local garden club requested a tour. Theodore's mother mentioned at dinner one night that her son had started asking for seed catalogs instead of video games. The Duke stood at the wall one final evening in late summer beside Margaret, watching the last of the season's light fall across rows that had started as an insult and become, somehow, the thing that brought life back to a corner of his property he'd avoided for 10 years. "You never told anyone I said it," he said. "About the seeds." "I didn't need to," Margaret said. "The garden said it for me." He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. Some things don't need to be argued. They only need to be grown, patiently, until they speak for themselves. Engagement question. If someone underestimated you the way the Duke underestimated Margaret, would you have confronted him directly, or let your work speak for itself the way she did? If you believe quiet persistence can outlast even the harshest first judgment, share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, consider liking the video and sharing it with someone who's ever been counted out too soon.